you didn't have to try to be Jewish. You didn't have to join and find a synagogue and join a synagogue. You didn't have to read books about Jewish content to become knowledgeable. You were born and bred into Judaism the same way we're born and bred into being American. David Ellenson said, basically every American teen 20 years ago, I mean, probably today, knew the name Michael Jordan. That's part of the culture. That's what people know. And that's the same way Judaism was for most of history. You took it for granted. It was like the air you breathed. But not today. In the 20th century, really starting in the 19th century, when ghettos began to fall, Jews were admitted to secular universities, Jews could go into certain professions, Jews could join the military in France. And so now there was still anti-Semitism, of course, but the society had opened up to Jews. And so the question is, how does Judaism adapt and survive to this new world? And that's the question that many, many rabbis and thinkers over the last 200 years have tried to answer. And that's what David Ellenson devoted his life to study. How do we survive? What are the problems? What are the issues? Where are the tensions? And so just imagine that big looming canvas. That's the problem. How does Judaism survive in the modern world? And David studied this from several perspectives. First, as a historian, you have to look at the documents, you have to look at the key figures, you have to see who was who, where was where, how was how. Secondly, he studied it as a Jewish legal scholar. So if you think about it, Judaism is composed, traditional Judaism is made up of laws. There are laws. If you're going to have a glass of wine, you say the Kiddush. If you're going to have some bread, you say the Motzi. If you're going to wave the lulav and the etrog, you say a blessing. There are many laws, dietary laws about kosher foods. Judaism is a religion of laws. But as in most situations, sometimes the law is not clear. That's why we have lawyers. That's why we have judges. And much of the Jewish scriptural tradition after the Bible is legal in nature. So it was many times, until the 19th century, if you were a rabbi, you really didn't give sermons. You didn't make pastoral calls. You didn't really even conduct funerals or do those kind of things. That's the bread and butter of being a rabbi now. Essentially, you sat all day and you studied. And when people had complex legal questions, they came to you to resolve them. You were sort of a judge and a counselor. That was the role of the rabbi. They were a legal scholar. It only changed in the 19th century because Judaism began to change and rabbis began to be more like a Christian pastors. And so that's how the adaptation occurred. But much of Jewish tradition is based on legal opinions. And David studied these. And he studied them to understand what was going on in the world. And we're going to look at some of those because they're really interesting. Sue, you have a question?
Yeah. Because I was thinking about something that happened in my own family, which it wouldn't have made a big. My great-grandfather was a cantor in Lithuania.
Mm-hmm.
And his daughter, my great aunt, was betrothed to someone.
Mm-hmm.
And she, they were arranged marriages.
Mm-hmm.
And she fell in love with someone else who was also betrothed to someone.
Yikes.
And the two of them eloped. And it brought such shame on the family that my great-grandfather lost his position in the synagogue as the
You told me
cantor.
about this once, I think. Yeah.
And so you're talking about how do you, because that wouldn't happen today.
No. That reflected the insular Jewish world where it was more tribal and, you were kind of expected to follow certain norms. And if you didn't, you were shunned from the community. That still exists in the ultra Orthodox world.
That's how they happened to come to this country. They had to get away.
It's a good thing. Yeah, I mean, this is also this is apropos, this is not directly related to David Ellenson, but one of the things to always remember about American Jews is that most of our ancestors, they were the sort of not the black sheep of the family, but they were the risk takers. They were the people who came here were the people who couldn't find good work and a meaningful life in Europe. The immigrant generation were the tough ones. They were the outsiders. And so we're the descendants of those people. Now that changed, of course, after World War II. It was anybody, but they were often the less educated. They were tended to be the younger siblings, the ones who came to the United States, because the older sibling would often take over a business or whatever, a farm. And it was the younger sibling who didn't have any job prospects who said, okay, well, I gotta go to America. Yeah, it's fascinating self-understanding. So the legal lens is what he studied, and we're going to look at some of that. The third lens is he was a sociologist. He deeply studied sociology, which is very important. And we're going to get, sociology is the study of human belonging, of community, of what makes community, of religious ritual. So that's important. And the fourth aspect is he was a shaper. Not only did he study Jewish life in America, but he helped shape it as president of Hebrew Union College and training rabbis. So he was one of the rare people that are both a scholar and an organizational leader. That doesn't happen very often. So let me give you a little bit of biographical background, because it's just so interesting. You know, he's not your typical Jewish leader. David was actually born in Newport News, Virginia. I'd never heard of it till heard of it, knew that he was born there. Newport News is at the southern end of the Virginia Peninsula, right near the town of Hampton. And it basically, it grew for a couple reasons. First, there was a railroad connecting Newport News to Richmond, Virginia, which in Richmond was, the capital city. It was an important town. And the coal industry was very big in Newport News and Hampton, and there was a major shipping yard. So Newport News had a commercial significance, and that led to the building of a small Jewish community. David's dad went to Harvard Law School, smart guy, and he married somebody, I believe from Newport News, and then he went to Newport News and practiced as a lawyer. And that's where he grew up. And there were only 2,000 Jews in Newport News, Virginia at that time. This is, 50s. I think 2,000 Jews, I mean, just imagine our High Holy Day sanctuary plus 500. I mean, it's not a very big Jewish community. The city of Chicago's about 400,000 Jews. So this 2,000, so it's a small Jewish community. People knew each other. And there was no Reform synagogue. There was only Orthodox and Conservative. And his family belonged to the Orthodox one. And it was the stricter Orthodox one. There were 2 Orthodox synagogues, and this was the one with the mechitza. Mechitza is a separation between men and women. Today, all Orthodox synagogues have mechitzas. Not back then, maybe half did. It was not required. Orthodoxy today is much stricter than Orthodoxy was 50 years ago. So that's a whole nother interesting topic we can discuss. But they went to the one with mechitza. But interestingly, in such a small Jewish community, the separation between Orthodox and non-Orthodox is not as strict. Everybody knew each other. Everybody socialized with each other. And David talked about how even though the rabbi at the synagogue said, don't do B'nai Brit, which was a pluralistic, kids from all different denominations, he did. And his mom encouraged him to. So even though there was some, he faced some pressure to be more isolationist and Orthodox, that wasn't his mode. He was pluralist. But he also wrote, and I found this very powerful, he said that this town was both a place of intimacy and a place of alienation. I was in the South and I partook of and was informed by its heritage and manners. But as a Jew, I was not of it. Part of me felt I never really belonged. It's interesting, which kind of makes sense. If you're Jewish growing up in New York City, it's pretty easy to feel like you're a part of it. It's the city is so big and the Jewish neighborhoods are so strong, and it's, you have instant community. Whereas if you're a Jew in a small town, especially in the South, it's very different. You're accepted because you're white, but it's not the full kind of acceptance. And I think that lasts, that stays with somebody. I think it's probably still true today. I remember growing up in Milwaukee, we had a guy in the synagogue who was from Racine. Not a very, it's not like that isolated, but it's a small little town and there are not many Jews there. And he was one of the most active members of the synagogue. In some ways, he was active to make up for not feeling at home where he was. They probably have a lot of people at Asrui who come from smaller towns in the Midwest. And so anyways, yeah, or for sure.
My kids.
Right. And look, and they all went to more Jewish neighborhoods when they were adults, right? Yeah. Yeah. So this sense of loneliness and a desire to belong, he says, partially led him to study sociology. So he went to college at the College of William and Mary, which is where his dad went. So William and Mary is famous about Thomas Jefferson went there. It's a beautiful school. It's a Virginia kind of school. And then he went and got a master's degree at the University of Virginia in religious studies. And this was a key turning point. And I want to go in depth here a little bit. He says that his approach to religion was shaped by three primary thinkers: Soren Kierkegaard, Emil Durkheim, and Max Weber. Everyone heard of all those? Or okay. Yeah, okay. Okay. So I'll tell you, this is very important and interesting. So Kierkegaard, a very important Danish philosopher, 19th century, but in Copenhagen. And Kierkegaard is considered the first religious existentialist thinker. He was Christian, and he maintained a connection to Christianity, but he did not believe in sort of the establishment of Christianity, to go to church and say the prayers in the order you're supposed to say them. He was much more interested in the subjective experience of faith. What is it saying to me? He was almost interested in the irrational. What are the mystical teachings? What's going on in my heart as I say these prayers? This is why he's considered, he was asking questions that most Christian thinkers at that time were not asking. In some ways, he was a Christian version of Jean-Paul Sartre, who's considered sort of a modern existentialist thinker. And that was a part of his thinking, sort of questioning, but he was also deeply faithful. He wrote a very famous essay called The Night of Faith, Kierkegaard did. And it was an analysis of the Akedah, of the story we read on Rosh Hashanah morning, where Abraham goes and God tells Abraham to take his son Isaac, walk up the mountain, and offer him as a sacrifice. And Kierkegaard wrote an essay where he describes Abraham as a knight of faith, that he was willing to set aside. It's called suspension of the ethical, which sounds horrible, but this idea that I will be obedient even if I don't understand. And so we might think that's totally irrational. But what Kierkegaard is saying is that there is a mystery, there is an irrationality in religion that keeps us connected to it. And that Abraham embodied that. Of course, at the end, God doesn't carry it out, but Abraham had faith. God, he knew that God would never lead him to do something so destructive and terrible. So this was Kierkegaard's essay. And what Ellenson took from it is that you can be confident and you can be very, very comfortable in your faith, just like Abraham was comfortable doing what God said, but you can also be subjective and have your own personal experience of faith. And that's the existential part. Kierkegaard really shaped him, as it shaped a lot of Jewish thinkers in the 20th century. That's Kierkegaard. Second thinker is Emil Durkheim. Durkheim is very famous for having written a book called Elementary Forms of Religious Life. You might have read it in college, may not remember, but this is sort of standard. And so Emil Durkheim founded the field of sociology. And what's really interesting about Emil Durkheim is that he was the son of a very prominent French rabbi. So he grew up intensely Jewish, yet he was not involved in Judaism at all during his life. But clearly his way of thinking was shaped by Judaism. And his sort of most famous belief is that religion has nothing to do with belief. Religion has nothing to do with what you believe. Religion is purely a set of practices relative to sacred things. It's and now beliefs play a role, but beliefs are not the defining feature. Practices and belonging are. Here's what he said. He defines religion as a unified system of practices relative to sacred things. That is to say, things set apart and forbidden. Beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church. We would say Jewish church. Although he would say that. He's using church in the sociological sense as a gathering of people. All those who adhere to them. For Durkheim, it is the collective and communal nature of religion that is key. The supernatural or spiritual dimension of religion is not his concern. Here's what all religions are equally true and false. Faith is not the point. Religions share the basic goal of giving communities the structures, rites, and rituals to respond to common human emotions: joy, grief, thanksgiving, awe, and so on. So this is a very sociological view of religion. So he would say, why do we have Shiva? No, I was just at a Shiva a couple nights ago. Why do we have Shiva? So that we have something to do, some way of connecting with the community in a time of loss and despair. Why do we have funerals? I mean, think about that. Why do we have a funeral? It's not easy, especially for the mourner. It's very hard. But we do it because we feel a need to honor somebody, and we need some sort of ritual to mark this. This is something that deeply affects us, so we need some sort of ritual to mark it. It's not because I doubt anybody. One of the reasons Jews have funerals fairly quickly is it said, until the body is buried, it's in purgatory. It's not really in a comfortable place. I don't think any of us really believe that, but there is something powerful about a funeral in that it provides some sort of way of marking this feeling. And Durkheim said that's all of religion. Why do we have a service Friday night? Do we think that Shabbat? Do we think Friday night to Saturday night is some sacred time? No, but it is nice every week to get together and to say certain prayers that we know, and to see people that we know, and to hear melodies that connect us to one another. That it's about community. That was Durkheim's great insight. People hadn't thought. Now we might take that for granted today, but people didn't look at religion that way before. If you've ever, there's a Clifford Geertz, who's a very famous sociologist, wrote about Bali. He studied, ancient religion in Bali, and he made the same kind of point, that all the superstitions, all the different practices, they're just ways of bringing people together, creating community. So this reinforced the community part for Ellenson. And interestingly, just a note, because we're going to talk a little bit about Zionism too in Israel, but Durkheim wrote this book, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, right after the Dreyfus trial in Paris. The Dreyfus trial was where Colonel Alfred Dreyfus, who was the highest ranking Jewish officer in the French military, was charged with treason in an absolutely made up charge. It had no basis in reality, and everybody knew that, but it was still pushed forward. and it led to massive marches in Paris with people yelling death to the Jews. And that was a time when Paris was considered the most liberal, sophisticated, enlightened city in the world. And so here's this budding sociologist seeing this group mayhem and destruction, and he was talking about the power of groups and what brings groups together and the reality of anti-Semitism. And he was kind of saying, you know, he was kind of affirming the need for a Jewish community, regardless of religion. Okay, Mordecai Kaplan sort of picked up on Durkheim later, but that's we don't want to go down that road yet. Now, the next important thinker, these are all modern thinkers. This is why it's so important. Is Max Weber. Max Weber is most famous. His most famous book is called The Protestant Work Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism. And that has nothing to do with Judaism, but that book is so famous because what Max Weber said is that the Protestant idea, and this is really true in Calvinism. You know, Calvinism said that people who are rich and successful are the ones who are chosen by God. It's called predestination. That if you achieve, it's a terrible thing to, you know, most of us probably, but if you achieve great success in the world, you are blessed by God. And that's you're showing you're God's elect. And this was John Calvin, who was a Swiss theologian. But what Max Weber said is that belief led people to work hard to show that in order to be successful, even though John Calvin said there's nothing, you don't work hard for it, God gives it to you or God doesn't give it to you. It's something that's preordained. But human beings took that as a sign that if I can show that I'm successful and work hard, and then I will be one of God's elect. So he says that created what's called the Protestant work ethic, where people would work hard, and that shaped America. You know, people in America work harder than anywhere else in the world, and that's all. You know, we workaholism is real. So he says that, and that's true in the Western. I mean, that was true in the industrial age and so forth. But so that's his most famous book, the Protestant Work Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism, because he said that's also what created capitalism. That you constantly worked hard to improve, to innovate, to create greater success. But when it comes to religion, what was so interesting, Weber had what's called the secularization thesis. And he said the world is becoming more and more secular. And he said science is essentially replacing religion. That he called this the disenchantment of the world. That he called into question all the supernatural forces, the gods and the spirits with which non-industrial cultures populated the universe, into which they attribute responsibility for the phenomena of the natural and social world. In their place, secularization introduces as a competing cosmology the modern scientific interpretation of nature, by which only the laws and regularities discovered by the scientific method are admitted as valid. In other words, he demythologized the world. That we know where rain comes from. You know, in the Ve'ahavta prayer, if you read the full prayer, it says, we ask God to bless the fields with rain. What is that? We know where rain comes from. We know where climate, we understand all these phenomena. So that disenchants the world. And Weber said that means we have to reimagine what religion is about. And what else is interesting about Weber is he said Judaism started that process of secularization, which you think, oh, that's kind of strange. We have the splitting of the Red Sea. But what Weber says, you look at the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and they're pretty logical. God does this, God does that. Nature unfolds in a very logical way. Now, it's from the hand of God, which we would say is anti-scientific. But Weber is saying it was a logical unfolding of creation. And that the Jewish mind, that the Jewish approach to the world was the beginning of the disenchantment of the world. Now, he's using disenchantment in a positive sense. I know it kind of sounds like a negative word, but it's a positive sense in that it's embracing a kind of rationality. Now, if you think about it, if you look at other ancient Near Eastern cultures, they're not very like what's the name? I'm blanking on the name of the culture, but it says the world was created by all these conflicts among the gods. I mean, Hellenistic Greek culture, but it was constant conflict and warfare, and total chaos that ultimately leads to creation. That's not how the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, sees creation. So Weber says Jews had a unique outlook on the world. It was the beginning of the scientific outlook. And then this is very, Weber calls Jews a quote pariah people. Again, pariah is not meant to be a negative here, even though it's a negative word. What he's saying is Jews were always outsiders. As a sociologist, he's right. Jews were never they were never fully in the larger culture. They were in sometimes and out at the same time, often. You think Jews in medieval Spain, they were in the culture. Jews were at the highest level of government in Spain. Don Isaac of Ravenel was the Secretary of the Treasury, the equivalent. Maimonides was the physician of the court. I mean, Jews were integrated, but they were always outsiders as well. And that Weber's a sociologist as well and a philosopher, but he identifies this sort of insider-outsider status. And I think his whole approach to the world influenced Ellenson in both understanding secularization. I would argue today, this is, now I'm riffing my own view. We are in a period of massive secularization, even more than 100 years ago. And that's partially it's because of the internet and the democratization of knowledge. 30 years ago, if you wanted the answer to a Jewish question, you had to kind of call up the rabbi and go and or maybe you could drive over to the library and go in the card catalog and look it up and maybe find the book, maybe not.
Encyclopedia Judaica.
Encyclopedia Judaica.
Anybody wants, I have a big copy in my basement.
Jewish Book of Why.
Yeah,
Jewish Book of Why.
you could make an effort, but typically, if you wanted a real answer, you would go, and you wanted sort of comprehension and discussion. You would go and talk to a rabbi, find a community. There were gatekeepers, in other words. There's no gatekeepers anymore. You want to know the answer, you just Google it. You for anything. You find some videos on YouTube. You find threads on Reddit. So now, why does that lead to secularization? Because religion depends on some degree of authority and hierarchy. Always. There is a body of knowledge. Now, some religions are more democratic than others. Reform Judaism is more democratic. There's room for interpretation. But there's still no Reform rabbi will say, yeah, sure, it's totally fine to celebrate Shabbat on Monday. There are limits. There's still a hierarchy. So we live in a world of just massive leveling, and that undermines traditional religions. And furthermore, the world is just imbued with science. I mean, just look at the number of medicines, pharmaceutical. We look at the world in a very secular way. Even those of us who are members of synagogues and take Judaism seriously, we generally are most American Jews are pretty secular in their outlook. You just see that, for example. I remember seeing this during COVID. The people who take vaccines by religious breakout, Jews were like so far higher than any other group. It was like 99% got the vaccine. Whereas every other group, I think Indians were pretty high, like Hindus. I think Hindus were like 90, 95%. And Christians were like 60. I mean, it was like a vast difference. We have a deep faith in science. And so the sort of traditional religious myths are not, they haven't really defined Judaism. Yeah.
So would you think that one of the reasons for increasing secularization is science? Because when you think now about what astronomically they are discovering about the universe and multiple universes and more planets and more than anybody, it's very difficult then to believe in a living, breathing God.
Yeah.
Because when science is like proving that all wrong.
Yeah, I do. I do think that tradition science absolutely undermines traditional religion.
Yes.
But in some ways, I think there are other ways, especially Jews can connect. One of them is sociology. That's why Durkheim is so important. Do we believe, like if you go to synagogue on Yom Kippur, do you really believe that suddenly you're forgiven for all your sins for the past year? Like God is looking down, listening, and saying, "Okay, I don't, I'm a rabbi, and I don't believe that's exactly what happens." But there is something powerful and cleansing, and feels good to go on that day. It does. So there's a sense of belonging and practice, and I think. And there's people who tried to study this. Is there like a God gene? Is there something in us that wants to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves? And the jury's still out on that. But I think there's a need for some sort of faith, but it's not going to be the traditional kind, except for some people it is. But but that's one of the lessons of Max Weber. It's this idea of secularization.
How do you spell his name?
W-E-B. It's like Weber.
Oh, Weber.
It's like Weber. It's like Weber, but he's German, so it's Weber. Yeah, like Wagner. It's got the V that sounds the W.
Like Krakow.
What?
Krakow.
Yeah, Krakow. That's right. Okay, so Max Weber is his importance cannot be overstated, so all these three thinkers, Kierkegaard with his existentialism, Durkheim with his sociology and sense of belonging, in Weber with the reality of secularization in the modern world, shaped Ellenson's view of Judaism. So he gets a master's degree at University of Virginia. And then he kind of says, well, I don't, what's next? I want to make my living in religion. And this is kind of funny. He kind of said this and he smiled. He said, basically, I didn't know what denomination. He never really knew much about Reform Judaism. He wasn't a committed Reform Jew. But his dad said to him, if you want to make a living as a rabbi, go to the Reform Movement School. So I don't know if they had done pay surveys back then and said Reform rabbis make more than conservative. I don't know. But his dad said, for practical reasons, go to HUC. So he did. But at the same time, he decided to get a PhD in Jewish thought at Columbia. So somehow he was going to rabbinical school and getting a doctorate at the same time. I don't know how anyone would do that. But that's what he did. And he studied, his main teacher was a guy by the name of Jacob Katz, who since passed away. Jacob Katz was a sociologist who studied the Jewish ghetto, who studied what were the practices and traditions and way of life of Jews who lived in shtetls in Eastern Europe. And the first ghetto was really in Italy, I think in Venice. So that kind of way of life. So that's what Ellenson studied. He also studied with someone named Fritz Bamberger, who was a philosopher, but he was somebody who really combined academia, traditional Judaism, and Reform Judaism all together. And then his first position so he gets ordained as a rabbi and gets a PhD and gets a job at Hebrew Union College. So that's Hebrew Union College actually tries to hire, if some of its rabbis, people encourage me to get a PhD. I didn't want to go back. I was done with school. But typically, if you get a PhD, HUC will then hire you like because they like having people who became rabbis and got a doctorate and then will teach future rabbis. So he teaches at HUC in Los Angeles. And his first book is really interesting. And it's about a modern Orthodox rabbi named Azriel Hildesheimer. Now, Orthodox, we tend to think, if you think about Orthodox Jews, you tend to think their orthodoxy has been the same for the last 2,000 years. That 1,500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, Orthodox Jews did the same thing that Orthodox Jews do today. And that's not true. That's any sociologists. Everybody changes. The way the black hat and the black coat and the black pants, that's how Polish noblemen dressed in the 17th century. If you looked at a rabbi from the 1200s, they didn't dress that way. I guarantee you that. They did not dress in a black hat. They may not have even worn yarmulkes that we know. Yarmulkes came in sometime in the Middle Ages, but certainly before the Middle Ages. The orthodoxy changes, and he knew that from his own youth. And the real period of change was the late 19th century. And this rabbi named Azriel Hildesheimer was really important because he was born into a prominent traditional Jewish family, but he was the first in his family to actually get a secular education. So secularization in Germany, not in Eastern Europe, but in Germany, spread to even the most traditional Jewish families. So Hildesheimer went to a secular gymnasium, that's like a really good high school, and got a PhD, University of Berlin, and then became an Orthodox rabbi. So he looked at these questions that people were bringing to him through both a more secular lens and a more religious lens. And this made him quite interesting. So for example, he was asked about the conversion of a child. If a child is born, this is not Hildesheimer, this is one of his contemporaries, I should point out, but same kind of thing, Ellenson studied. If a child is born to a non-Jewish mother and a Jewish father, does that child require, like what needs to happen for that child to be considered Jewish if they're raised Jewish? Now, today, any Orthodox rabbi will tell you they're not Jewish, period. Maybe when they're adults, they can study, they can go through a conversion process just like anyone else. But late 19th century Orthodox rabbis would say, now they would disagree, not everyone would agree with this, but the ones that Ellenson was studying said, this child, they said Zera Kodesh, which means holy seed, that this child is, if they're being raised as Jewish, even though it's just the father, not the mother who's Jewish in heritage, that there is a presumption that they can become Jewish in an easier fashion. They still have to go through some process, but essentially, these rabbis were open, much more open in terms of orthodoxy than we see today. Other examples about women's prayer. Can women study? Can women say certain prayers like the Kaddish? Many 19th century Orthodox rabbis were absolutely open to these ideas. And that came from this interaction between like a secularizing culture and traditional Judaism. It was intellectual, it was fruitful. And that's different than today. It really is. Today, there's still modern Orthodoxy, but if you think of Orthodox Judaism today, you generally think of black hats and Haredi. First of all, they're just much more, they're much more numerically dominant. That's a function of birth rates. It's just a function of culture. Modern Orthodoxy is small, and it's getting smaller. So the kind of flexible, open-minded orthodoxy that he studied and that really thrived in the late 19th century doesn't really exist anymore. In fact, what's our time?
It's 7:45.
Oh my God! Time flies by. I want to give an example. This is kind of fun and interesting. I'll have to summarize a little bit. Anyone here been to New Orleans? Yeah. Toro Synagogue in New Orleans, very famous synagogue. There's a Toro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island as well. Judah Toro was a very successful businessman, born in Newport, Rhode Island, but ended up living in New Orleans. And he didn't have kids. And so he, didn't have to spend a lot of money on his kids like lots of parents do today. So he had a lot of money when he died, and he split it up, and he built two synagogues, one in New Orleans and one in Newport. And New Orleans, the New Orleans City Council wanted to build a statue of Judah Toro. This is in the 1850s. This is before the Civil War. They wanted to build a statue. And here's I'll just read this. Several years after his death, I.J. Benjamin, journalist, describes in his autobiographical, the Portuguese congregation of New Orleans proposed erecting a statue of Judah Toro to the lasting memory of the man who had been a benefactor to so many congregations. And they sought the assistance of other congregations in New Orleans in the hope that other congregations would also join in. The statue of Toro would be cast in bronze and it was to be set up in the outer court of the Portuguese synagogue. But there was all kinds of controversy. What about idolatry? Don't Jews, you don't go to Israel and see many sculptures of people. There's not sculpture because it bordered on idolatry. And so the rabbis of New Orleans wrote to some very prominent rabbis in Europe to get their opinion. And it's very interesting. And so Ellenson translated the responses of the prominent rabbis in Europe to this question. Can the statue be constructed? Okay, so I'm gonna read it. Let's turn to the third page in the packet. And here's the answer. This is Ellenson's translation from the Hebrew of the response given to this question by the most prominent modern Orthodox rabbi, Samson Raphael Hirsch. Now he's responding in the summer of 1860. So, by the way, just historic, the statue was never built because the Civil War got in the middle of it. It would have been built during the Civil War, and that occupied his attention. So it never happened. But here, to the Toro Monument Association in New Orleans, your desire to erect a stone or metal monument in memory of such a distinguished man, on the condition that this deed does not run contrary to the laws of Torah, the customs of Israel, and you have honored me by asking me to express my opinion on this matter. Behold, the erection of a monument in the image of a man, whether from stone or metal or any other material, is whatever place or for whatever purpose, is forbidden by the Torah. Therefore, it is forbidden to erect a statue, even if it has no form or image, in a place where the public gathers for the worship of the Creator. However, the law concerning the erection of a monument that is not intended for the worship of God is not completely clear. So, one rabbi says it is forbidden to erect a statue altogether. No statues, period, end of story. However, other rabbis say you have to question the purpose of the statue. Now I'm on the fourth page. According to our knowledge, there were occasions when monuments to events or important places were erected. However, no place do we find the erection of a monument in the memory of a special man, even the most important. There is only one instance of a monument being erected in memory of a special man, and that was Absalom. That was King David's son. Okay. So, essentially, Samson Raphael Hirsch is saying there is no way in Jewish tradition that we ever honor somebody with a statute because it is in a sense deifying a person. And then he goes on, and you should not contend on account of persecution. During our long exile, there was not a fit hour. He said, if he's basically saying there were far greater men than Judah Toro, and if we didn't erect statues to them, why should we elect one for him? He goes on and on. On the next page. This is the kind of thing that Ellenson loved to translate. In posing your question, you said that you wanted to consider the laws of Torah and also the customs of Israel. So the laws and the minhag. However, we have a law that obligates us to observe the custom of Israel, for the custom of Israel is law. And if this is so, there is no need to distinguish between custom and law. Therefore, it is clear that you have refrained from acting on your intention and moving from planning into action, even though your intention is to honor the memory of a precious and distinguished man as good and proper. Okay. And he basically says by the end that Judaism prohibited the erection of any statue or human figure. And then at the end, this is beautiful. This is a wonderful translation. And this I'm on the last page. And the story is told at the end of chapter 5 of JT, Jerusalem Talmud, Shekeli, that once Rabbi Hama Bar Hanina and Rabbi Hoshai, his teacher, were strolling before a magnificent synagogue in Lodrum when one said to the other, "How much money my ancestors invested here?" Rabbi Hoshua said to him, "And how many souls did your ancestors invest here? Did they not have children who labored in Torah? Therefore, gentlemen, and perhaps you will thank me for this suggestion, it would be advisable for you to establish a foundation from the funds that you would have taken for the creation of a memorial and take the yearly proceeds to assist a deserving man for his benefit and elevation. In this way, you will honor the memory of a precious man more than through the finest statue of marble and bronze." Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? So what was so great about Ellenson is that he took this is something that very few, even educated rabbis would ever study. We don't study. The study of responsa like this is really for the full-time scholars who spend all their time sitting in libraries reading through Jewish literature. But Ellenson realized that a lot of beautiful moral lessons, like what we're seeing right here, were captured in those responsa. And so he translated and brought those out to share with everybody. And this was one of the interesting things. This essay, where he has the translation, was part of a collection in tribute to Rabbi Norman Lamb. Norman Lamb was the head of Yeshiva University, which is the modern Orthodox seminary. And Norman Lamb didn't have very nice things to say about Reform and conservative Jews. That's another. But Ellenson had a certain spirit, that even if somebody, it's like two wrongs don't make a right. If I'm invited to present an essay, I'm going to present an essay and honor somebody, even if they're not as accommodating to my set of practices as I would like. That speaks to the character of who he was. And that's why I really loved this response. Questions so far?
I just had a comment because I have been reading his book.
Yeah, good.
I think I've gotten as far as chapter 4.
Yeah, no, it's a hard book. Yeah.
But I think that Ellenson, I got the impression that Rabbi Ellenson was a very welcoming individual, and that he included everybody, in his thinking. He thought more of the human race than he thought only of religious Jews, so to speak. I mean, I found him really kind of, as a personality, captivating.
Yes. I think there was a deeply humanistic strain. That's where Orthodoxy, see, every denomination, and next week we're going to talk about denominationalism. That's my theme for next week, because that was another area where he wrote a lot about Reform, conservative Orthodoxy. But every denomination has its strengths and weaknesses. One of the strengths of Orthodoxy is the sense of community. It really is. When my wife was, she got a master's degree at Baltimore Hebrew University, and one of her close friends when she started grew up Reform. But this friend of my wife's became more Orthodox over time and ended up marrying somebody Orthodox and started living a fully Orthodox life. She had a real hard pregnancy and a very difficult birth. I think it was a preemie. And anyways, it was very hard. But the Orthodox community rallied around her like nobody. And she didn't know me. I mean, she was relatively new into Orthodoxy. But the community was so nurturing and so supportive. And my wife saw that and said, there's such a deep sense of community. And I think that's still true. The flip side of that is that there's not much room for change or flexibility or creativity. If you're an artist, if you grow up in an ultra-Orthodox community and you don't see things, or you're gay, or so if you are different, you're going to be shunned, and you're not going to be welcome. And that's the flip side of community sometimes demands conformity, and in the best of all possible worlds, a tight community would be welcoming, but oftentimes the two don't go together. So that's Orthodoxy. Conservative Judaism, one of its great strengths is it really takes tension seriously. Like if you are a conservative rabbi, and let's say you are wondering about whether to ordain women as rabbis, which was, in the Reform movement, it wasn't much of a debate. It was mostly a function of timing. Once universities started admitting women, or certain universities started becoming co-ed, the Reform movement is very much attuned with the progressive ideology, what's happening in the world. And it wasn't very, when Sally Priestley was ordained, it wasn't very controversial at the time. It wasn't. I mean, people, it was a big deal. I'm not saying it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't controversial. When the first female conservative rabbi was ordained, it was immensely controversial because they really take the law about that women should not be rabbis, and there are pretty clear Jewish texts about this, seriously. So they went through a whole process of real struggling with texts. And the conservative movement still has that struggle. And that struggle can be good. Sometimes we take an easy way out. We do what's convenient, and sometimes convenience isn't always the right answer. So the conservative movement is good in that it has that struggle. The bad side about that is that in general, the conservative movement can feel very hypocritical. It can say, well, we want to welcome interfaith families, but we're not even going to attend your wedding. And
we're certainly not going to be the clergy there.
And we won't list it. I mean, many conservative synagogues, they won't list an interfaith wedding in the bulletin.
Oh.
Yeah, this is true. Some have changed, but that was the general practice. So we want to be welcoming and we're struggling with it, but we have to abide by it. So it can feel hypocritical. So that's a weakness. You look at Reform. Reform has got a lot of strengths, right? We're very welcoming and inclusive and wonderful. You can be whoever you are, and it's great. However, community is hard. We don't have many people who come on a Saturday morning. We don't, it's not and sometimes the sense of obligation is missing in Reform. And so we would rather be a wide tent instead of leaner and meaner. But sometimes when you're lean and mean, you have a real strong sense of commitment. So that's hard in Reform synagogues everywhere. And we can be wishy-washy too. We can, it's sometimes hard to figure out what the appropriate boundaries are. We deal with certain, we have had this issue, but it's not a big issue. We're pretty clear on. There are some Reform synagogues where they have teachers that are essentially anti-Zionist, anti-Israel. I wouldn't allow that. But many Reform rabbis would feel kind of, well, we want to welcome every kind of opinion, and if there's some people who question the existence, you have to draw a line somewhere. you know, but in Reform Judaism, it's hard to draw that line. You know, we don't want to draw it too tight. So anyways, the reason I say all that is that somehow Ellenson was able to kind of embody the different strengths of each of the movements. You know, he had the knowledge and commitment of orthodoxy in a way. You know, he was very much a community-minded person, but he also had the inclusiveness of reform. You know, he was he was just a truly welcoming, loving presence, and embraced people of all different points of view. And there was tension too, though. He recognized that not everything is easy. He wrote some beautiful, we didn't have time for it today, but he wrote a wonderful essay about Israel, and he felt the tension about, he wanted to live in Israel. He wanted, you know, he wanted that to be the center of his life, but he loved being in America. And so that sense of tension, that is part of conservative Judaism, he felt that too. So he embodied all of that. But next week, we'll get into his views on denominationalism. Thank you, guys. This has been wonderful. Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Absolutely. If you have questions, you can come up to me and we can talk about it, but we'll jump into some.
When was the last time you had spoken to him?
Maybe 4 or 5 months ago. Yeah, we stayed in touch. When I first got into rabbinical school, I landed in
You are
Israel.
doing it?
Oh yeah.
That's what I thought.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
When I applied to rabbinical school, the president was Shelley Zimmerman. I didn't like him, but I thought he was fake. I didn't.
Well, neither did the movement.
I turned out to have.
He was there very shortly.
I turned out to have. been
Google
very
him.
prescient.
It's a Me Too story.
You know what? I mean, it's a Me Too story that's even more disgusting than.
It's
Yes,
terrible. Shelley Zimmerman.
So I didn't like.
Come to me for the.
I said to my mom,
the cup.
I'm like, something's off about this guy. But anyways, still.
You were so
Yeah,
nice
that's
about it. Sorry.
But anyways, when I got I had written an article, a scholarly article for the Reform Movement periodical when I was still in college, before I went to school. And Ellenson sent me a note that he had read it, and it was like a personal letter. And I was like, wow, you know, so it's so touching. And then when I was in Israel in 2001, 2002, it was a really bad time, kind of like it is now. In some ways, might have been worse.
It was terrible.
There were
The
bombings
Dakota.
every week.
Oh, yeah.
Because there was no fence. There was no, and Ellenson visited, you know, he was based in New York, but he must have visited about 7 times. And he would meet with us, and, you know, take us out to dinner, you know, schmooze, and, you know, he was almost like a father figure. You know, he would call our parents, you know, because our parents, you know, we were only like 23, 24. So, so we got to be close. And then when I was in rabbinical school, I took a seminar with him. That was a great class. There was not very much formality about him. That's one of the things I liked about him too. He was just easygoing. You know, I took a class with him. It was a 9 to 5 all day class. We were studying these texts. I couldn't do it now, but somehow I could do it then. I could sit and study for all that time. And then we had a lunch break. And I remember him coming back from one lunch break, and he said, I just raised $50,000 for the college. You know, he was like a kid, you know, because during lunch break, he was making phone calls to raise money. And so he was just kind of, you know, an easygoing, fun person to be around. And so, yeah, we would exchange emails. Sometimes I would tell him if I'm working on something. And I think we were talking and I'm going to share this. This will be in the 3rd session, an article I wrote based on the class I took with him about conversion. And it was a really interesting article, essentially, that there were Orthodox rabbis in Israel that said that essentially proposed like a secular conversion. That if you are somebody who wants to move to Israel and be part of the Israeli army and live there, but you're not Jewish, these rabbis said there should be a quickie conversion process, which is like today, that would never happen. No. But that was the reality 50 years ago, which was so interesting. And their logic is very much consistent with the idea that Jews are a people, a nation, much more than a religion. So thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank
Yes,
you.
absolutely.